Welcome. It's our second book club discussion, and today we're talking about an incredible book, Phaidon, and I'm very privileged to have with me a few of Phaidon's amazing contributors in various different guises. So I have Simone, Rocha, Yasmin Sewell, David, Koma, and Hettie Judah. I want to start by talking to you, Hettie, because you edited the book and you wrote the amazing preface to it. Can you just tell us a little bit about Phaidon and the ideas behind it and where it sprung from?
Well, Phaidon is one of a number of books that Phaidon have done where you take 10 different experts in a field and ask them all to select or nominate kind of people that are doing something exciting. And that gives a really interesting overview because everybody brings a very different perspective to it. So you've got stylists, you've got other designers like Preen and A.F. van der Vorst, you've got bloggers like Tavi, you've got SHOWstudio who also contributed to it, and people see different things happening at a different moment.
Because Yasmin, you were one of the curators, weren't you? Can you tell me a bit about what the process was like, you know, in picking these 10? That must have been really hard.
It was a bit of a race, actually, for me, because I heard about the book. I knew the guys at Phaidon had approached me about doing the book. I knew about the original book sample, which I loved, and we talked for a while about doing Phaidon, and I knew I was going to curate it. I knew I had to pick my 10, and it was like, who am I going to get really fast? You know? And I remember there was more than 10 that I wanted, obviously, and I wanted people that I had a really close relationship with, so I could, because I'm not a writer, and I had to write the blurb about them, and I thought, well, I can do that if I know them. You know, I can say what I feel about someone I know. So I did I bagged Christopher Kane, like straight, like I get him, then I want him first. You know, there's people I went for immediately that I know really well, and there was a few more designers that I wasn't able to do because they couldn't fit into my 10 that I worked with closely. But it was a long process. You know, people had to get approved. I had to make sure that our lists weren't conflicting.
Yeah, I was going to say, was there a little bit of tension
between
different
and I was like, who got J.W. Anderson? Who got Simone? You know, who got them? You know, so it was a bit of a. Yeah, it was good. It was a long process, but yeah, I think everyone's loved being involved in and the product is beautiful.
Yeah. So Simone and David, so you were selected to feature. That must have been really exciting for you guys because there's an incredible. We were talking about this before we went live. There's an incredible, you know, array of people in here, from accessories to fashion. What did it feel like to be chosen?
I was chosen by SHOWstudio. So Alex came and talked to me about it, but no, it was amazing, and I knew I have the other Phaidon book. So once he said, you know, we're curating and it's a book for Phaidon, I was like, oh my god, that is unbelievable. He's like, oh, can I come and have a chat? And he always played it kind of cool, and I was like, oh. And then now that I've seen the book physically, I'm like, it's phenomenal. Also, even though I knew I was one of the designers, I didn't know who else would be in it. And I thought that was so interesting when you look through the book, that not only is it like young designers, what I thought was great is it's like designers in old houses as well, like new designers in existing houses, and then the mix of men's, women's and accessories. So it was a huge compliment to be featured, I think.
Because David, you were chosen by Heather, that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was very exciting news for me because I knew about the book, and I kind of had the previous.
You had samples.
Yeah, before, and you know, I loved the layout of what was inside, so it was kind of very exciting what they're going to come up for the new one, and I don't know. For me, it really feels exciting when you're part of the book because it's something that captures the really kind of important moment and period, and then it stays forever. And also because it's going to be, you know, sold not for like one or 2 months like a magazine.
It's not seasonal.
Yeah, that's.
It's really interesting that you talk about kind of capturing that important moment, because I wanted to ask all of you about this idea of kind of a generation of designers, because you mentioned that in your preface. You mentioned this idea of what kind of defines the designers working at the moment, and it's kind of a big question, so I'll pose it to anyone. But what do you think are the kind of codes that run through this generation of designers that we're seeing at the moment?
I mean, I think for me the funny thing is that suddenly I was talking to people or reading about people that took the 90s as a reference, and for me that just seemed like yesterday, so it was suddenly a real shock that was something vintage. And I think that for me marked the fact that this was in a way, a whole new group of people coming out with their own voice and their own vision. In terms of what defines the generation, it's not a stylistic thing really at all. I think we can see shifts from the book before. You can see the importance of really fabulous art schools and people like David and Simone being drawn to London because of St Martin's, other people being drawn to Antwerp from as far away as Thailand and Indonesia. Also, I guess there's public and corporate funding going into fashion weeks in various centres, which is helping to support young designers come through. So in a way, that's helped define the generation as much as anything else. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think also it isn't a stylistic thing, I agree, but also from my point of view, being sort of on the more commercial side of fashion, understanding retail and the business side, I was around a previous book, late 90s era, you know, and a lot of the brands in the previous book I worked with really closely, and I look at all of them, and it is very different now, and I've talked about this a lot, is that a lot of these guys that I work with, you know, they're not around anymore, they didn't really understand the business side. I mean, I think everyone that I deal with now, no matter what level of creativity they're at, they understand, they need to know the business part. And maybe that's why the couture houses have really come up, because there's a bit of a definition between what's going to work, has to work at a retail level, and then there's the couture collections, which are the extreme part of, you know, the extraordinary part of what we do. What we have access to. But that's what I mean, I see the difference there. People can sustain a business now. They kind of know that there's ways to do that. Back then, this book, it was different. In fact, most of the guys that were in my shop, that I had in my shop in like 1998, they're in this book. Maybe 2 of them are still around, and there was about 40. So.
That's interesting that you mentioned this, because I know you talked about this in the preface, but Imran Ahmed, who was also one of the curators, you know, he mentioned that he chose people kind of on how they'd managed to be as creative in terms of how they did their business as how they did their collection. So he mentioned Jason Wu, I think it was, as his example. But
yes, and he really admired the way that he managed to, you know, identify iconic pieces that he was pushing, that people identified with his label. I mean, I think Imran sees it very particularly from, you know, literally the business of fashion. But also what's so interesting is how the business of fashion has changed between the 2 books. And you've, of course, got the impact of online retail, which means that you can be creating quite a niche brand like Damia Doma that maybe has a very particular appeal to a group of people that are spread out across different countries around the world, and that they can get hold of pieces from that really work for them. But that maybe is not going to necessarily work somewhere like Liberty, for example, that's going to need a bigger turnover or that needs a larger selection.
I'm interested to get your opinion, David, on kind of working in this kind of environment, because that is something that does run through the book, this idea of, you know, having to build a business. Do you ever look at the people who maybe inspire your work creatively and think, oh, they had it better back then, you know, they didn't have these same pressures? Do you think about that?
To be honest with you, I didn't. I look at these 2 books and I think it was then and it's now, and I didn't analyze too much about what exactly changed. I was just looking, it was very exciting to look, because it's quite a large amount of designers, and to see who's out there, and usually if you want to look at designers, it's like quite particular websites and magazines, and it's very pre-selected, and because the book covers designers not only from London or Paris or New York, but it's much wider. And I just love the fact that, you know, so many different professionals selected and put together what is this moment and this generation. So I didn't have enough time to analyze what was back then, knowing that I wasn't back then yet. And I just loved that.
I'm really interested that you mentioned that kind of geographic element, because I think that's something that's really special about the book, you know, as it breaks away from this kind of, those cycles you get stuck in. I think, as you mentioned in the Fashion Week coverage of kind of New York and Paris and Milan and London, whereas the book does have much more of a kind of international focus. Do you think that we should see that kind of reflected more in the fashion coverage we're getting? Because if you look at sites like Style.com, even on SHOWstudio, we do focus on those 4 cities too much, and are there the opportunities for designers working, you know, whether it's in Asia or other places in Europe, to get their work out there other than in things like Phaidon?
I mean, I think what's interesting is that having operated outside of the UK until quite recently, although in Britain you were very, very conscious of what was happening in London Fashion Week, when you had those great big French collection guides, you know, you'd have 120 pages for Paris, 80 pages for Milan, 80 pages for New York, and kind of 3 pages for London, until very recently. And then suddenly with this book, curators from all over the world were clamouring to have London-based designers. And it's shown that London's really, really come of age as a fashion city. And that's just, you know, I think that's the great work that's being done by people like Topshop to kind of promote young designers, and London Fashion Week's really kind of held in there and promoted people in a very healthy way, Fashion East as well. And I think that really shows that other fashion weeks elsewhere in the world, you know, if they just keep plugging in and getting the right support, they can become really important centres. It shows
really
how it can change.
That's very relevant to your career, obviously, Simone, because, you know, you have worked with some of those amazing support channels that we have in London, and I think so many of the people featured in the book, whether it's the accessories designers or the fashion designers, have had that kind of benefit. Someone like, you know, Nicholas Kirkwood or yourself. Do you think that's part of the success of sort of your generation?
Yeah, I was in Fashion East when I came out of St. Martin's, and I did 2 seasons with Lulu there. And what you were saying earlier about there's a much more business focus, I think that is really evident because of all the support today, and I don't think this generation had the awareness of it. Now, you know, there's teams of industry people like with New Gen, and it's also current, you know, all the people you're talking to are current and very much in the industry, so you feel much more aware of the business and like how you want to grow it yourself, even though you're obviously a creative. But I think what's really put London on the map now is definitely the support from those schemes. I don't know if I'd be in the position I'm in now if I didn't originally go into Fashion East, and then I went off schedule, but now I have New Gen and Topshop. I get shown their space this season, and, you know, you'd never have that opportunity. It's like, it's actually phenomenal, and I think it's because here, you know, it is such good teaching. By the time you come out of college, people do feel you're ready to take on that support. So that's why, and I think because obviously I'm Irish, and I go home a lot and I do some projects at home, and people always say to me, you know, how come there isn't a huge Irish fashion industry, or, you know, how come you went to London, you know, and I get it all the time when I go home, and I like, the way I feel about it is like, I'm like, if it needs to be supported in the right way from home first. So all these other designers that aren't based in the 4 capital cities, you know, they need to build up their structure at home to then get on the same level. So I don't know,
Did you have a similar experience to that?
Yeah, I think in London, I mean, back then and now, education has been, you know, to really high level, and all the colleges, I mean, I did my BA and MA at St. Martin's, and it was, you know, incredible time, and the best time of my life. I enjoyed it. And then from the creative point, it's been always to the top level, and then, as Simone said, with the New Gen and different scheme support, we were really lucky because we had a full package from the education point, and we as all young designers who come from London recently, and that's why I think London getting stronger and stronger, because I think it's balanced between now a creativity and business side of it, and I think it's only going to be going higher. And
that's attracting designers that weren't educated here as well. I mean, Peter Pelosso was at, well, Christopher and Peter were both at Antwerp, and coming over here, it really gave them support to launch.
And there's a great sort of collaborative spirit here, I think, as well, which is something that I think is really great about the book, because I do think that comes across, you know, this idea of celebrating a group of talent rather than individuals, and it's very kind of the sense that this is a team of people, even though they all have their own labels and their own brands. I'm interested to go back to something you mentioned, Yasmin, when you were saying, you know, when you were talking about sample and saying that some of the names that you see in them? Because that sample's from 2005 and they're not around anymore. What do you think is the key to stopping the same thing happening with the designers we're seeing in Pattern?
I don't think it will happen again. I think that this bunch of designers, all so talented, incredible designers, I don't think they quite had the same chance. Again, the resources that people have now. So when I said before, and I thought about it, you know, that most of these guys that I worked with in this book are no longer around or are not in the same industry or have their business, which is very sad. That probably won't be said in 10 years' time of this group, I really don't think, mainly because of the support that's happening now and the general awareness of the industry. And I think a lot of designers of today, you know, admired these guys back then. You know, they grew up looking at these guys and they've maybe seen them come and go and that they, you know, they want to do things differently. It is a very, very different time in fashion. It's still very exciting. There's still lots of movement. There's still amazing creativity. Look at that book. Yeah. But there's just much more awareness of business now. It's just the world that we're living in.
What other changes have we seen other than that increased awareness of the kind of commercial aspect? Because you do unpick quite a few. You talk about, you know, kind of whether it's the rise of minimalism or the rise of digital print. What do you think of the other developments we've seen?
Well, I mean, digital print's an extraordinary thing. The way that you can make pattern these days and do it fast and do it in, you know, small batches, you know, almost individually printed garment to garment is just extraordinary. And then, I mean, you know, obviously 3D printing is something that only a small number of people are doing. Iris van Herpen, of course, is doing these extraordinary structural forms, and I think it was Jordan Askill was doing these you know, amazing kind of waves of horses kind of rearing up like tidal waves. I think 3D printing is something that could become interesting in a few years' time, more interesting, but I think digital printing is a big deal. Again, I do think quite often it's more to do with, you know, the distribution, the global awareness, the fact that, you know, for example, things like style.com have arrived and people are immediately seeing collections as soon as they come out. Whereas before it was just a very rarefied group of people that have access to this, and then it was mediated and filtered by the fashion press. And, you know, the fashion press were then also having to make choices about who they covered. So, you know, if somebody was a bit marginal, they possibly weren't going to get that much attention. It was more difficult to get the attention than, you know, back then. And I think now, you know, everybody has access to all of these collections being shown in, you know, slideshows on style.com, and people immediately can kind of start blogging about whoever they think is exciting.
Start ordering it. I mean, you can actually order straight away. That is a huge point, actually. It says the consumer is completely aware of everything that's happening. They want the newness. They're hungry for it more and more and more. That things have to be delivered earlier and earlier. So just the fact that the industry itself, there's so many more stores, online stores. You have your own online store. So, and people, there's just a bigger awareness of general, you know, customers who want more access to fashion, more diverse fashion, you know, new brands, avant-garde fashion, even couture houses. You know, there is, people are hungry for content, product.
Yeah,
hungry.
I'm interested that you say, you know, content as well, because David and Simone, you must have noticed that, you know, there's this thirst. People want to see your catwalk images straight away, but they also want to see, you know, like backstage, and they want to hear from you, and they want to know what you think. You know, there's
like it's impossible. It's literally, but that's it. You're like, because what you do when you're doing a show, well, what I do is, you know, you work on it for 6 months. You're in the studio. It's all about the work. It's all about the show, and you know, I mean, you're researching, and it's, you know, you're making up all these stories in your head about what it is and the girl and her journey, and then you get someone being like, okay, so we want to see the test of this, and we want to see the backstage for this, and we want to see what you eat for lunch, and you're just like, what? You know what I mean? Like, it's something, like we were saying this earlier on, came in and having a cup of tea, or like, it's something when you're in college, you're totally unaware that that's what it's like, and it wasn't always like that. My family are in fashion, and it like they're just like, oh my god, like I can't believe how much, you know, there's Twitters and there's Instagrams, you know, and they're like, it's unbelievable how much you can be exposed when still you've done so little to an extent. Like, well, like, I've only done 6 seasons, and then suddenly, you know, people in, you know, Seoul can like click on and see what you like, and then they can buy it, and it's just like, in one way it's really exciting, and you know what I mean, it's the planet, it's the world, but at the same time sometimes it is a bit exposing when you're like, I'm a designer, I'm you know, show, making a few frocks, you know what I mean? And then it's just like, and it's something that I don't think you're aware of until now, you know, when you come out.
A new course at the college on
yeah. Are we going to start getting out a term at St Martin's on like how to do a good Twitter feed and stuff?
Actually, I think it's quite good that at St Martin's they don't teach extra things and just allowing us to be creative and focusing on something that it's different and don't be scared of anything. I think I find it part of big success of a lot of designers who graduate from there, because I know that it's important to know industry and important to know a different side of it, but it's later we kind of have a whole life to get to know it. And you know, I personally really enjoy in college being creative and not knowing what's going to happen exactly, and just having dreams and predictions and not being told 100% and discovered myself and learn, you know, on my own mistakes. But that was quite exciting. So and one more thing that I just wanted to mention, it's quite interesting to look at this book and compare it to Sample, because nowadays high street fashion is very strong, and access to really good product from high street for the general public is huge. So it's plus I believe so much more people want to be in fashion and do fashion. So the whole market has grown from different sides. So it's interesting to see how it's evolved, because back then you wouldn't be able to buy for a good price a designer looking clothes in such huge quantities and qualities everywhere. So even though, actually that's what I wanted to mention, even though designers from our generation, they're kind of more aware of business side and educated, but that we have much bigger competition to big high street, big brands which grow, growing and growing. So it's a very different balance. So in 10 years we should see what happened with us and how where we're going to be.
But there's an interesting reaction to that we were talking about before we went live, about this kind of the rise of the kind of couture type. And it's interesting that you mentioned Iris Van Herpen's work, because she does that very kind of beautiful, ornate. And do you think part of that we're seeing, even what you're doing, Simone, with your focus on these beautiful, incredible textures and this kind of handmade, crafty movement we're seeing, do you think in a way that's a reaction to this, as you mentioned, these big high street stores and the fast fashion thing we're seeing? Yeah,
we were talking about it as well, and your work is so kind of hand done, so meticulous, has so much process put into it, and that degree of attention is not something you can reproduce with any degree of ethics on a mass scale. And I think it's the quality of the materials, it's the handworking, it's the process, it's the know-how that in the end ends up defining the difference between these high fashion pieces and high street knockoffs, really.
Have you noticed that, Yasmin, in terms of what people are, what shoppers are interested in, what people are buzzing about, what women want to wear? Have you seen more of a focus on, that kind of luxury couture type?
Not on a mass level. On a bigger level, generally I think it's unfortunate in some ways, people are just wanting those trends fast. So that's why there's such a business for them. It's why the high street's doing so well. That's what they're hungry for, that look for less. But yeah, in terms of a different customer, couture customer is a whole other level, but people who really appreciate great design, they're obviously going to really appreciate that even more now, and know they're not wearing a piece that just looks like something that is something that's made a certain way. But that's still kind of a big minority, really, or small minority, and I think that it does, like David was saying, designers do have to think about that. They have to think about how they're going to, you know, be different and stand out, and how they can justify those price points, so that, you know, what David or Simone will create is going to be at a different level of what you can buy in a cool way on the high street. And how does the customer who isn't as educated on fashion and design get that? Is she going to get that? Oh, actually, I can just get it for £100. I don't need to buy into that, you know. So, you know, that's definitely a challenge, and it will definitely create sort of like people that will stand out at this time, and you know.
I mean, without sounding disgusting, in a way, that's one of the nice things about this book, is that the people that are choosing the designers are people that quite often have touched and seen the collections. They've seen the creation. They've understood what it is that goes into making a garment, that goes into creating a good collection, and they've got that kind of sensory, tactile experience of fashion that's very different from somebody looking at images online and selecting stuff that just looks superficially attractive. And I think that's where it's great to have these 10 different curators that kind of have these different visions, bringing them all into this book.
Because you must find that, Simone, because it's interesting, because we were just talking about your window at Dover Street, but there must be an element with your work, you know, where it is that ability to touch it and, you know, try it on and interact with it that, you know, you want people to want to engage with.
Definitely, and it's clothes. You want people to wear it. You know what I mean? And but yeah, I think it's about today. Also, I know we were talking about print earlier. I don't work in print, so I work a lot more with fabrics, and I do a lot of handwork, like in our studio. And I just think it's, for me, I think you can tell when something's been worked in the hand, and because there's so much accessibility to fashion today and so much awareness, you know what I mean, that to make it really special, I think it has, for when I'm designing, I want it to be personal to me, and I still have to think that it's really special. And then it's because you're so aware of everything around you, you know what I mean, and you know, you make a dress, then you see it. Like, I had a dream last night that my collection that was in this book was in H&M, and I woke up and I was like, oh my god, I was like, the craft gets lace, they've put it on t-shirts, and like, I just literally, but like, it was a dream, but like, it could have been a reality, you know. Like, but that's how it is now, and you have to be really aware of it. But I think if you stay really true to the craftsmanship of it and the working of it, and you know, what I do is I make sure that we have like a really good product, because I'm very lucky to hang in stores beside amazing labels, and you want it to be to that level, and you do have to just separate it in your head, you know, and you can't think of the H&M nightmare dream and think that could be a reality. You really have to step away from it, otherwise, and that's, I think, how hopefully people like yourself can break through it and then, you know, continue on, you know. 26, like to be doing in 26 years. So I think it's a really good time to, you know, focus on what you're doing yourself as a designer right now, which can be hard as well, because there are so many, and there's so many portals and so much things going on. So I think, as exposing as it is, you have to try and stay a little bit insular.
I'd like to pick your brains, Yasmin, about this, because, you know, you have championed a lot of designers. You know, you've brought them over and you've launched their careers, and you've kind of really pushed them into the forefront. What is it that you look at someone and you go, that's going to work, that's going to click?
Oh, it's really just...
it's a huge question, I'm really sorry.
No, I mean, there's only really my answer. It's always just about instinct, really. Obviously, because I do come from the sort of more the commercial background, you know, the business retail background, which is my thing. So that's always in the back of my head. That's always sitting there, and I get that. But I don't really look at things necessarily in a commercial way. You know, if a new designer that's doing something really extraordinary, and I've been doing it for such a long time, it's just, you know, how does that feel? Does it feel right? You know, it's got to do with the person as well, and what I can see their vision is, and are they tuned into now? Because you could do something that's amazing, but it's not relevant today. You know, it's like, oh, I'm not really feeling that dress, or that, you know, that fabrication or that silhouette's not quite right. They're not there, and you know, so it's a lot to do with timing. For me, it's instinct, and you know, I mean, look, there are so many talented people in the world, but the ones that really make it are tuned into, you know, tuned into the right thing that's getting them the right timing, the right placement, the right vision that just seems to work. And you know, it's sometimes it just all falls into place. But there's no other answer besides instinct and just like passion. Oh, love it, you know, just because I love it, you know, and I can get it wrong, but you know.
Do you think that is what unites all the designers in pattern? Because it's interesting, you know, you mentioned this idea of everything just being kind of relevant.
Yes.
And I think there's something about this kind of popular mood that happens in fashion, you know, where people can be doing really diverse things, but it's like they've all kind of woken up and got this kind of a feeling of what's gonna happen, and you see that through pattern. And what leads a mood like that, whether it's the mood for digital print or the mood for minimalism or the mood for sort of these demi-couture pieces?
There are a lot of moods. I mean, if you look at David and Simone, there's two very different moods there, but they're both totally relevant. So it's not like we're in sort of the late 80s and that is the movement anymore. You know, so there's a lot of things going on at the moment. It's just a matter of, and there's a lot of different women and men who want different things, and they all happen to be right. So there's sort of a lot of room for it, but still it has to feel good for now. I don't know how to explain that, but
like current.
Yeah, current. Yeah, and it's
because you can make beautiful clothes, but sometimes it could be dated. You know, it has to have, I think, a reality to now. It has to sit now, even if it's inspired by something with a heritage or is done in a classical way. It has to have a current feeling now. You know, when I'm like, oh no, I'm walking down the street now. You know, even if it is, you know, a huge tutu, whatever. You know, it can work. You know, but I think it's about whatever the feeling is, it feels current. Yeah, and that's hard to explain unless you sort of like feel that, you know.
Yeah, the mood to it.
It's a mood.
I think a lot of it's to do with people's ability to just kind of, you know, express and communicate that kind of mood as well. So when you've got somebody that's got, you know, a really, really independent vision, and they're maybe really ploughing very much their own furrow, I think things like being able to have kind of Tumblr or being able to have a blog or their own website allows them to put imagery out there, allows them to communicate a mood and a story in a way that can make it really relevant to other people and can be very attractive to them. And I know it's a massive additional pressure for people working today, but in a way you could connect very directly with your audience in a different kind of way that's not just to do with the clothes, but shows a kind of wider interest that shows the story that things are coming from.
Do you sorry, Nick.
Also, I mean, couture and high quality and handwork never going to die, and it's going to be always a customer who will appreciate that, you know, because I consider that as art, and it's always going to be a collector's. But what's different nowadays is, I mean, the way I work, you know, I love craftsmanship and I love handwork and lots of hours in garment, but as what I think in modern world is very important, how your clothes look through, as I call my digital eye, which is camera, because like in past people didn't care about that so much, and there are a lot of textures, fabrics, and a lot of work which takes hours and hours, which not going to be appreciated because 95% of people are going to see in that small image. So I don't know, it does change what I design or what I select, and it could be some incredible fabric that if you touch you understand, oh my god, it's so expensive, incredible, but on camera it looks like nothing, so I would not go for it if it's not something unnecessary, especially if it's like chiffon and takes, you know, hours and hours to cut. So that obviously, you know, affecting. And you know, in my case, for me, both important. So I struggle and I spend too much time on, you know, getting the image right and texture right. But I think you've mentioned when nowadays, because and also online shopping, it's the new big thing, not new big thing, but it's the thing now, and it should work for that because
visually it has to look good online.
So and the hyper really, you know, when it should look very often online pieces look not as good as in life, but that's what sells. So I think the balance should be right. So that also, I think, affecting the design and designers
I think
nowadays.
that's a really big point, actually.
But in calling in images for this book, it was also quite interesting looking at the people that were really taking control of their imagery and the way they were presented. I mean, since we've got that camera up there, Phoebe English, who's done some things with you here at SHOWstudio, I mean, she makes these films that really express a lot to do with the texture of her pieces, because you know, she actually works with she does a lot of handwork with her garments.
Yeah, she's incredibly talented, and when you see her work up close, it's.
But what she does is she makes the films that really show you the kind of texture of that. And there are, I mean, we can barely see it, but there are a couple of stills from these films here. But the way that she makes these little, I mean, they're almost like, you know, like a music video or something, but for the garments, and it shows the movement and the texture and the whole mood of the collection in a very interesting way. And I think this kind of thing becomes an interesting way to express the things that are important to a designer, that express things that are important to a collection. When you've got, you know, if you want to show that there's texture and tactility and movement to things, these are the kind of tools that are quite useful for people.
I'm really interested that you mentioned it, because it's actually one of the questions I wanted to ask, because I think it's in the preface you say the book is almost as a kind of, might have been in the press release, the book as being almost like a catwalk show, and it got me thinking about this idea of how to present fashion, and whether it is just on the catwalk, or whether, you know, how designers can take these new opportunities, whether it's doing, you know, a book, whether it's doing a fashion film, obviously that's something very dear to us here, or whether it's, you know, doing an installation. And it seems people are really kind of embracing that different way of presenting imagery.
Yeah, I think people want to do that, but unfortunately, if it's not on style.com or on those sites, it doesn't get nearly the awareness it's going to get to reach. So quite often people will just have to go with a show, otherwise you really do miss that big boat.
Do you think we will see a bigger change in the next sort of 10 years, maybe when we're doing the next pattern?
Maybe then, or maybe the big guys, the big sites everyone's looking at will also showcase installations and films and things like that, rather than just runway shows, because that's what's happening now. So if that happens, that will open it all up, which I think will be really good for designers.
Yeah,
I think now they have to think that way, and you know, if you just don't get on that list, it's too damaging, I think, for the season for them.
Yeah, it's difficult because again, it's another piece of financial outlay for the designers as well. But I mean, it was interesting. You know, there were some designers that really. I mean, I chose this page as well, Niels Perra. He's a designer from Antwerp. He's got a very, very individual vision. He's extraordinary. And he creates these photographs, and he always uses a particular kind of model, and he uses kind of lots of very soft textured fabric and a very particular kind of lighting. And he's definitely kind of developing an online identity through this kind of imagery. But a lot of designers don't really own any quality images of their work. There are a lot of people that kind of don't even have the rights to their own catwalk images after a certain point, and it's perhaps not that important. You know, it became difficult when you're editing a book, but maybe in the larger level it's not. But I think what's interesting, particularly with designers from the Academy in Antwerp, is that they're very much kind of brought through with this ethos that you don't really deserve attention. You have to really present your work in a very particular way. You really have to present the whole story out there, and you have to have very good images. You have to have, you know, arresting styling. And there, you know, it was notable. There were, particularly with the Antwerp-based designers, you had these really strong photographs coming through. Again, I don't know what the economic impact of that is, what the business impact of that is. Maybe it's just, you know, good for that kind of first foot through the door moment when you're talking to people about getting shows, when you're trying to get people in to see your collections. And
after I did Fashionista, I didn't get sponsorship from Newjet, and so I showed off schedule in a little house. And what I'd done is I'd done a little cavity collection for Topshop, and that funded being able to do a little show on my own. But that season I made a film because I wasn't on the schedule, wasn't going to get on style.com, wasn't going to get on Vogue.com, and it was like, okay, so we, a filmmaker friend of mine, Niall O'Brien, I said he'd make a little film for me. And I think, because I was like, I'm not going to get on it, it's not going to get out there, but you know, there's a little bit of awareness because I've been in Fashionista, but this is how I'm going to have to go about it. And I think when you're in it, you kind of figure out, you know, how is the best way to get yourself exposed. And I think maybe, obviously, because Antwerp isn't London or Paris or New York, you know, they don't have the support, so they don't have the shows. So I think that's what makes them so good at creatively getting their message out there. Which I think is brilliant, and I think it's good because through the book you can probably see that there's so many different avenues, and I think that's so important and I know I came through Fashion East and then New Gen, but it's so good to see that it can be done in so many different ways. You know, it doesn't have to be a certain path. You don't have to go to a certain school, you know what I mean? You didn't have to do a certain masters. You know, the masters we did was amazing, and you know, Louise was phenomenal, and it was, you know, so good for me to do that. But this is a really good example that it doesn't have to be done that way, and I think that's really important today, because we were saying earlier, there's so much focus on London, and it's amazing, but then you do have to be like, oh wait, it doesn't have to be that way as well. And I think that is really good that it's cemented in a really heavy book.
I think that's a really lovely note to end on, because I do think that sums up the book so well. You know, it's showing all these different people from different areas presenting their fashion and their clothes and their jewellery in completely different ways, and that's why it's so beautiful and lovely. So thank you so much to my wonderful panellists.
Thank you.
Thank you.